Alright, again, welcome back to this another amazing lesson on Spring Boot playlist. And I'm very excited and happy to see you back again on this another video. So this is a video which is going to explain how to implement one controller endpoint, which will then add the student to the database. So we are going to implement one controller post mapping endpoint, which will then use the serves layer which we created in the previous video to add and upload the student to the database. So before we deep dive into the content of this video, I would like us to take a few recap of what we covered in the previous lesson on implementation of the serves layer. So we have already created a simple Spring Boot application where we created one controller endpoint which simply returns a simple string, and then we created database initialization by adding the properties in our properties file, and then we created a symbol module that is the student entity, and we also created the corresponding JPA repository which is going to persist that entity in our database. Then now in the previous lesson just before this, we created a serves layer where we created a simple serves interface with one method for adding the student, and then we created the serves class which implements the interface and it overrides that method, and we were able to inject the JPA repository which we were able to use to use the save method of the JPA to add the student. So in this particular video, we're going to implement the next layer, which is the controller layer, and we're going to add one endpoint here for adding the student, and this endpoint will be called by any REST client, for example the postman. And once the client sends the request to this endpoint will now call the serves layer, and then the serves layer will now call the repository layer, and then the repository layer will now call the database, which will now add the data to the database. All right, so without waste of time, let us go and to the code and start implementing how we can create this symbol controller endpoint. So to avoid a lot of confusion and that, I am going to generate the setters and getters for this student entity class, so that we don't get any error when we upload the student or when we send the request. So I'm going to generate the getters and the setters for all these fields which are in the student, and I'm going to click generate getters and setters. But later on in the subsequent videos, we are going to use another tool called the Lombok dependency, so that we can avoid this a lot of boilerplate code in generating the setters and the getters. But for now, let us go with this, and then in the next entity we are going to create, we will be using the Lombok dependency. All right. So after generating the dependencies, after generating the setters and getters for this class, we need now to create a controller which will have one endpoint for adding the student. So here I'm going to delete this one. I'm going to create a new controller from fresh, and I'm going to this controller package and create a new controller class, which I will call it the student controller. So this is where I'm going to keep all the endpoints which are related to student operation. So in this endpoint, because it is going to be a controller, I'm going to annotate it with a REST controller to tell Spring Boot that this is a Spring Boot controller component. And then I'm also going to add another request annotation called the request mapping, where I'm going to define the specific URL for my application. So I'm going to say API/v2. My application is version 2, and you can put any URL you want here. So when you provide the base URL, HTTP plus the base URL, then you need to add this. Now in this controller class, I'm going to define one method called the add student method. And this student method is going to simply call the service layer. So because I'm going to use the service layer, and then I'm going to inject this service layer as a dependency to this controller, because this controller is going to be dependent on the service layer. And then the service layer is going to be dependent on the JPA repository layer. And then the JPA repository layer is now going to call the database. So to add this dependency, I'm going to use this annotation called out, where it is an annotation which is used to add the dependency. And I'm going to declare a private field of the type student service implementation, and this is going to be of the type student service implementation. So I'm going to import this class so that we don't get any error. So it is going to be of this type student, let's say student service implementation, or student service. Now that I have this student service class as a dependency in my controller, then I am going to create a simple method, a public method, which is going to be the endpoint method for adding the student, and this method is going to return the type of student type. So let me import this one, and then the method name is going to be add student, so that it is somehow descriptive, you know what this method is doing. And the parameter is going to be the student, so you are going to provide the parameter which is going to be provided by this method, which is going to be used by this method. And then this parameter, we need to annotate it with another Spring Boot annotation called the request body, so that when you add this annotation called the Spring request body, you are telling Spring that this method is going to look into the HTTP request body, and then it is the body of that request must be of the type student. So when a client is sending the request, then the client must ensure that in the request body there is a type of the student type, the data of the student type. All right. And then because this method is going to be a post method where the client is going to send some data to be processed, then we are going to annotate it with a post mapping. So this is a post mapping which tells us that this method is going to be of the type post. And then we are going to add the specific endpoint, which is, I'm going to call it add student. But you can give it any name of your choice. So for me, I've given it add student, so that this endpoint becomes a bit descriptive. Now here I'm going to use the service layer class, so that I can be able to call the method for that service class. So I'm going to simply return the student service. This is student service dot add student. So I'm using this class to call this method, and this method will take the parameter which is provided in the request body of the type student. And now when I call this method, then this method, when you look into it, it is being implemented in the service layer, and this method will in turn call the repository, which the repository will call it is save method, and this save method now will save. You can see it is defined in the CRUD repository. So this save method is going to save the data into the database. All right. So this is a simple pattern of this architecture. So let me close this. So you can see that this is the JP repository. The JP repository is the core repository. So it is being extended by this CRUD repository. All right. So let me close this, and you can see now we have implemented a simple endpoint controller in this student controller. So when you are making the request, you will make a request to this URL and this endpoint, and then you are going to provide the type of the student in your request body, and then when you call this endpoint then the method, this method is going to extract this request body and then call this in turn call this subs endpoint, and that is going to go all the way up to the database where the student is saved. So let us run our application, and then we are going to test it in the postman by sending the request. So as the application is running, let us pause this video here, and then in the next video we will now look on how we can test our application using the postman client by sending the request from the postman, and then this request is going to be intercepted by the controller endpoint, and this controller endpoint is going to call the service layer, and this service layer is going to call the JPA repository, and then we are going to save our data in the database. So I hope you enjoy the content of this video, and I hope to see you in the next video where we now test the application. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and see you there.